Good evening. We start tonight with the news that Russia has formally approved a decision to send troops into Ukraine. President Putin left the world in little doubt of his intentions when he made the official request to his parliament to sanction the deployment, and they swiftly agreed. Ukraine responded by calling for general mobilization. Just yesterday, President Obama warned Moscow there would be costs if Russia intervened militarily. Well, in a moment we'll hear from Dominic Raghorn in Washington on what America's and the UN's next moves might be. We'll also get the assessment of our Foreign Affairs editor Sam Kiley on this latest development. But first, Sky's Alex Rossi reports on the day's events.
This has all the hallmarks of a military invasion. Unidentified troops, presumably Russian, now hold most of the strategic locations around Crimea. Their uniforms carry no insignia. But what is clear is the new government in Kiev has lost control of this territory. At the regional parliament, the men stood guard, their faces covered with balaclavas as inside moves towards political separation gathered pace. Pro-Russian parliamentarians have moved a referendum on the region's future forward to March the 30th. It's expected the vote will see this area annexed by Russia in time. No shots have been fired in this crisis, but Crimea has been isolated from the rest of Ukraine with surgical precision. This closed-circuit television footage shows the troops breaking into the regional parliament earlier this week. The police officers on duty are easily pushed aside. But the shadow war may now be over. The Russian upper house has approved the deployment of Russian military personnel inside Ukraine, it says, to keep the peace. The nascent Ukrainian government sees this all very differently. It's calling it an act of aggression and is accusing Russia of launching a full-scale invasion.
The Russian Federation has built up forces of 6,000 people. That is a grave violation. Around 30 armoured vehicles were deployed on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea.
But Moscow is denying this is an invasion. It says its actions are legal, and it's working in tandem with the Crimean authorities, who've invited them to stay.
We have an agreement with Ukraine on the presence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with a base in Sebastopol, and we're acting within the framework of that agreement.
There have long been separatist ambitions in Crimea. There's no trust here for the new pro-European government in Kiev. Those waving flags on the streets in Simferopol did so with a sense of victory.
It is very calm here and peaceful. A few hundred people have turned out. They support these troops that have taken control of the parliament building behind me. Most of the people here are ethnic Russians, and they see these soldiers as a positive force providing protection at a time of unrest.
There is no doubt Moscow is manoeuvring itself after the collapse of the presidency of its ally Viktor Yanukovych. The Kremlin still views him as the country's legitimate leader and the victim of a coup. The unrest is now spreading to the east. In Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, where pro-Russian sentiment is strong, there have been violent clashes. Is this the beginning of a counter-revolution? All of this agitation, of course, amplifies the sense of division, that this is a country that's cleaving itself apart.
Alex Rossi there. Well, let's look at how the military build-up in Crimea has unfolded and where the troops are. A group believed to be part of the Russian military are patrolling an airport in the capital, Simferopol. Unidentified troops have also been seen on the city's streets. They've also blockaded another airport at Sevastopol. Ukrainian border guards said more than 10 Russian helicopters were seen heading from Russia towards the airport. Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based in the city's port in Sevastopol. Armoured military vehicles were seen going out on patrol from here. So we're seeing minor but highly public incursions into a neighbouring territory. All the while there's been sabre-rattling from the Kremlin about protecting its own interests and citizens. So far, so familiar. Events on the ground seem to mirror Russia's brief but decisive invasion of Georgia in 2008. Sky's Foreign Affairs editor Sam Kiley reports.
This is what they're afraid could happen. War with a Russian bear invading to protect her cubs in a breakaway republic as she did in Georgia 6 years ago. This is what they got today, a bloodless intervention, so far. The Ukrainian Prime Minister was quick to condemn Russia and to claim credit for the relative calm.
We clearly understand that it is a plan to copy what they, the Russian forces, did in South Ossetia. That is, with bloodshed on Ukrainian territory in order to force a conflict. That's why the reaction of the Ukrainian authorities is very clear. We will not react to provocation. We don't use force. We demand that the Russian authorities immediately recall their troops.
Georgia lost South Ossetia to Russia after years of unrest and a 5-day war. Neither side wants to see a collapse into chaos in Crimea, not least because the region's Russian roots go very deep. Despite being transferred from Russian to Ukrainian control in 1954, Crimea remains very Russian. One clue is in the geography and the makeup of the population. Crimea lies on a peninsula and it sits apart from the rest of Ukraine. A majority of those living in Crimea today, 58%, are ethnic Russians. It's a vital strategic location for Russia, which has a huge military presence in Crimea. A deal signed in 2010 allows Moscow to station 161 aircraft and 388 warships in Ukrainian territory. Put simply, Russia doesn't need to invade. The Crimea already has its own autonomous parliament, and there are plans for a referendum on greater autonomy later this month. It's likely to further distance it from its pro-European capital, Kiev. Sticking to a Kremlin script, the pro-Russian Prime Minister of the Crimea called for Russian help.
Recognizing my responsibility for the life and safety of the citizens, I appeal to the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, to assist in providing peace and calm in the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea.
Seizing control of the Crimea has been easy, but does this mean a wider campaign is underway?
I don't think that Russia is ready politically or economically to venture into a military adventure in Crimea. I think they're simply using the region as a pressure point on the coalition government that has just been formed in Kiev.
Crimea has been spared the violence that hit Georgia, but the rest of Ukraine is in Russia's backyard, where the Kremlin will continue to campaign one way or another. Sam Kiley, Sky News.
Well, I'm joined now by Sam Kiley and by Sky's Dominic Waghorn, who's in Washington for us. Dominic, Obama says he is deeply concerned, but what is his next step, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. We've just heard that from a US official that saying that America's military posture is not going to be changed by this, and I think that can be interpreted to mean that America is not going to be sending any warships to the region, which was one option that was thought to be on the table, one option the President was considering. This looks very much like he is now restricted to diplomatic options, and none of those options are particularly good. We've heard howls of outrage from people like Senator John McCain, his Republican colleague Mark Rubio from Capitol Hill behind me, saying that this president threatened costs in his speech, his comments in the White House last night. He now needs to say what those costs are and start exercising these threats. But the Republicans also don't really have any particularly good ideas about what to do next. They are very concerned that this president seems to have been outflanked by Vladimir Putin in a game which the president says he doesn't to play. But at the moment, certainly the Russians do have the upper hand here, and they're keeping everyone guessing as to what their next move is going to be. And I think what's causing the biggest concern is the fact that the Russian parliament has authorised the use of military action not just in Crimea, but in the Ukraine as well. And I think the fears are that these riots, this unrest we've seen in Kharkiv and other parts of the eastern Ukraine could be used as a pretext for Russia to send in more military into that region, into areas beyond Crimea. And at the moment, America doesn't really seem to have any ideas about what to do about it.
Dominic, thanks very much. Well, Sam Kiley is here in the studio. America perhaps doesn't have much of an idea. What about Europe? What about the UN?
Well, the United Nations is likely to discuss the Ukrainian problem tonight in talks, but there won't be a resolution because the Russians have a veto, certainly not a resolution that would condemn their actions in the Ukraine. European Union, William Hague is going to Kiev tomorrow. He will be able to offer very little beyond moral support. So what does all this mean in the wider context? Well, there is a treaty dating back to 1994, not so long ago, a memorandum that requires, among others, several European nations, the United States and Russia, to defend the Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, the Russians will argue that that has not changed, unless and until there is some kind of secession or absorption of, say, the Crimea into Russian territory, and no kind of defence pact could be triggered, and frankly that is inconceivable. This is an area of Russian influence. They have the money, they have the weapons, and they can be expected to continue to hold on to the Crimea, albeit through proxies, and destabilise other parts of the eastern parts of Ukraine as an effort to undermine Kiev's intent to try and draw closer to Europe. And Europe doesn't have much money to help with that. They need to get the main Ukrainian economy back up off its knees and onto its feet, and for that they need some 35 billion immediately, and the money's not there, not in the United States and not in Europe either.
Fascinating stuff. Let's talk now to Alex Rossi. He's in Simferopol in Crimea. Alex, in your report you talked about the fact that many people where you are quite supportive of the troops on the ground. What would happen, do you think, if it was ramped up and if more troops were in that region? Do you think they would be quite as welcoming?
Well, certainly it's very difficult at the moment to say how many troops are in this region. The Ukrainian authorities, that unity government in Kiev, says up to 6,000. There may be many more, we don't know. The Russians, of course, have a base at Sevastopol. But for all intents and purposes, the unity government in Kiev has lost control of this territory. It now really has no authority here at all. Now, the Russians say that they are now helping the new Crimean government, which was voted in this week, and its infantry from the naval fleet is working in parity with them. There is also, of course, the sinister element of all of this. Those unidentified gunmen, we assume that they are Russian Marines or Russian soldiers, but as you were saying, certainly people on the ground, people we were talking to around the Parliament building, you should remember, of course, that the majority of people here are ethnic Russians. They welcome those troops. They are glad that they are here. They see them as safeguarding their interests, providing peace, really, and preventing this area from being overrun by the tyrannical new government that they see as being illegitimate that's taken root in Kiev. Of course, the other big development in all of this is what's been going on in Moscow. Vladimir Putin, the president of that country, asking his upper house, the Federation Council, to give him permission to use military personnel, boots on the ground, if he so wishes. That has now happened. It's our understanding that it won't probably happen tomorrow, even the next day. Possibly it may be a week or so. But the expectation here is that those unidentified gunmen who don't have any insignias on their uniform, expectation is the insignias in some time to come will pretty much soon be Russian insignias.
Alex, thanks very much. And Ukraine is likely to feature prominently in tomorrow's papers. We're going to be taking a first look at them at 10:30 tonight with the historian Kate Williams and the PR consultant Alex Dean.